Chapter 32. Dan and Malou drank their tea quietly for a few minutes before Damianos got up. "It's time to go," he declared, snapping his fingers again. Before Dan had time to articulate one syllable, he and Malou were surprised to be standing on a road leading to some village in the distance. "My God, Dan, will you have a look at us?" Malou said, patting down the inner pockets of a long coat that would seem to envelope her from neck to ankle. Dan wore a worn-out jacket, frayed at the elbows, and a shirt that looked as if it had been discarded from the last rag sale. His baggy flannel pants were held in place by a pair of suspenders, and both were shod of some sort of galoshes that definitely had seen better days. "What have you got in these pockets?" Dan asked, looking down at the bulging cloth around Malou's hips. "This," she replied, taking a potato out of one of the pockets. "I don't know if we're expected to bring these somewhere, but they're sure heavy." "It looks like you're carrying at least 50 pounds of them," Dan remarked, still staring down at the coat. "You two better get moving," Damianos said, climbing out of the ditch to join them. "We need to get to the village before nightfall." He too was oddly dressed, no better than a homeless person who had just come out of the nearest shelter. "Where are we?" Dan asked, his gaze travelling around him for the first time. "Look behind you," Damianos said, turning to face the mountains at their back. "Aren't those the Jezenki Mountains, the ones we just left?" Malou asked. "Right you are, Malou, and we are on the road to another village, but this is no time for chit-chat," Damianos urged. "Let's get going." "But what's the urgency?" Dan demanded. "Malou can't possibly carry that load by herself." He looked down at that coat again. "Well, if you'd like to take the coat and wear it, perhaps it would be better, yes." "I'm sure it would be. I sure would prefer it," Dan said, already unbuttoning the coat, taking it off from Malou's shoulders and exchanging it for his jacket, which he gave to her. No sooner had Dan donned the coat did they hear the roar of plane engines overhead. "In the ditch!" Damianos shouted, grabbing both their hands and dragging them down to roll into the gully and covering their heads with both arms as soon as they had flattened their bodies amid the long roadside grass. "What the hell is this?" Dan inquired, whispering. "This is the German Messerschmitt, Hitler's latest fighter plane." "You mean we're in the middle of World War II? Dan looked horrified. "And what would this plane want with us?" "Simply put, Malou, to kill us." As soon as the plane was over the road, Dan, Malou and Damianos heard the repetitive jerking noise of the bullets ricocheting against the pavement. Within seconds the bullet shot past them to end abruptly once the aircraft turned and began its ascent above the adjacent field. Dan crooked his neck around to see the Messerschmitt disappear on the horizon. He and Malou were aghast. "Why?" he blurted, glaring at Damianos. "Why have you brought us here?" "Fortitude, Dan, and for you to realize what it took for your forefathers to survive the horrors of 2 world wars. "What about these potatoes? What are they for?" "Enough questions, Dan. Let's get back on the road and walk as far as we can before the Messerschmitt comes back." And with these words, Damianos helped Malou to her feet and up the embankment. When they were back on the road, they heard a whimper of pain emanate from the other side of the pavement. Having no concern for his safety, Dan ran to the assistance of the man who had been shot and was now flailing in agony at the edge of the opposite gully. "What can we do?" he yelled to Damianos. "That poor guy's dying." "Nothing, Dan. There's nothing we can do for him now," their cat yelled back. "Come on, honey, please, let's go." Seeing that Dan had not moved from looking down at the man fading fast at his feet, he knelt down and crossed himself when he saw the fellow close his eyes for the last time. He straightened up and walked across the pavement in silence. "This is horrible, Damianos," he said when he returned to stand beside Malou. "There is no picture to capture and no word to describe what I've just witnessed." "I'm sorry, Dan, but fortitude is all-encompassing. Now, if you're ready to face the road ahead of us, I suggest we hurry as much as we can." Damien had been right, Dan reflected. His ancestors had probably lived and experienced days like these, and it was only now that he began grasping and envision the reasons for which his parents' families had fled their homes. A few minutes later, the Messerschmitt was back. This time the three of them just had seconds to slip behind a tree trunk to avoid the volley of bullets that struck the ground at their feet at an incredible rate. When they returned to the road, they noticed an old truck swerve out of control in the distance and burst into flames soon after. "Oh my dear God, Dan," Malou screeched, hiding her face in Dan's chest. "I can't believe this. This is dreadful." "I know, honey," Dan whispered in her ear. "But we've got to get to that village." "But why? Why, Dan?" Dan looked up at Damianos for answers. "Because the potatoes Dan is now carrying will feed the children of the village, Malou. They haven't eaten in days. The German siege has been long and hard on everyone living in the area." "You mean those who did not escape before the war started?" "Yes, Dan. Whether justified or not, those who left and survived, such as your parents did, left behind everything and everyone for the Germans to capture and kill at will." "Why didn't they all leave?" Malou asked. Well, some entire village or cities did. In France, for example, they had a true exodus. People by the thousands left their homes when the Germans began invading the north of the country, but thousands were killed in the same way, in the very same way as the two men you just saw succumb to the Messerschmitt bullets. Okay then, if kids need to eat tonight, Dan said with renewed vigour it seemed, let's get these potatoes to them. He looked up at Damianos. If fortitude is what I need, as you said, then I should have enough of it in me to get to that village. The determination in Dan's voice left no doubt in Damianos' mind that they were going to get to the village in one piece. A mile or so farther down the road, they saw a man come toward them. He was carrying what looked like a jerrycan of gasoline. He was about 100 yards from them when the Messerschmitt came down, all guns blazing, in a swooping attack right in front of their eyes. The three of them literally plunged to safety, only to hear the aircraft's guns jam at the last moment, but not before the bullets had managed to kill the man instantly, the jerrycan exploding in his hand. Trembling from shock, Malou raised her head when the three of them heard the Messerschmitt fly away from their location. He's a bloody maniac, Dan exploded. Why doesn't he leave those poor people alone? If he doesn't kill people on sight, he will be executed when he returns to the base, Damianos replied, getting to his feet. Are you okay, honey? Dan asked, noticing that Malou couldn't stop sobbing while pointing to the plume of black smoke rising to the sky as the remains of the man smouldered on the pavement. I will never be able to forget that, she replied, her voice choking into a whisper. Come here, Dan said, taking her in his arms. Only a couple more miles, and we will be able to give our potatoes to the kids. Her eyes red, Malou nodded as she held Dan's concerned gaze. I promise you I'll never ask you to buy a new fridge after this, she said, a brave smile appearing on her lips. Exploding in a nervous chuckle, Dan couldn't help himself when he kissed Malou tenderly. You're the most precious woman on earth, you know that? I don't know about precious, sweetheart, but right now I feel as grubby as the big lady I see sometimes near the market. Okay, kids, sorry to interrupt, but we've got to go, Damianos said, murmuring almost, Our German friend won't be gone for long. Without further incident, 2 hours later, they reached the outskirts of the village. People, women and children mostly, came out on the front stoop of their houses to wave and smile at them. The gracious smiles of the children's faces couldn't hide the fear and hunger in their eyes. At the end of the street, Damianos snapped his fingers to transport Dan and Malou to the refectory of the village church. Solangi and Damien were busy serving their boiled potatoes, scooping them out of a large pot and into a soup dish to the children sitting around the long table. Malou's tears expressed what she and Dan felt at that moment. The joy that coursed through their minds was suddenly enough to erase the horrific images of the killings they had witnessed on the road. The kids' faces were enough to dispel all discouragement or disgust they had experienced in the last few hours. An empty pot hanging by its handle on her arm, Solangi came to meet them. I'd say you have demonstrated that your fortitude and force of character has vanquished the enemy and fed children for a day, Dan. Hear, hear, Damien rejoined as he came to join Dan and Malou. You have done well, Dan, very well indeed. And you, Malou, I think after today you deserve not only a new refrigerator, but a new dishwasher wouldn't come amiss either. Bursting into laughter, the four of them followed Damien to the adjacent weed-covered cloister to have a seat on a couple of the benches facing the archway.